The ad was simple, almost too simple. Roommate wanted, $400 mo, utilities included, serious inquiries only. It was posted in the rooms for rent section on Craigslist, accompanied by a single blurry photo of a nondescript apartment. The price was absurdly cheap for the city, but Kevin wasn't in a position to be picky. He was tired of sleeping in his car and desperately needed a roof over his head. The poster, someone named Derek, responded to Kevin's email almost instantly. They exchanged a few messages, and within an hour, Kevin was on his way to check out the place. Derek's emails were curt but polite, and Kevin chalked up the lack of small talk to efficiency. The apartment complex was tucked away at the end of a dead-end street. The building was old, the kind of place that had seen better days decades ago. Faded paint, cracked windows, and a flickering porch light greeted Kevin as he approached the door. Derek opened it before Kevin could knock. He was an unassuming man, probably mid-30s, with a wiry frame and hollow eyes that darted around like a trapped animal's. "You're Kevin?" he asked, not bothering to shake hands. Kevin nodded, feeling a twinge of unease but dismissing it. He needed this. Derek led him inside without further pleasantries. The apartment was cleaner than Kevin expected, though sparsely furnished. A sagging couch, a coffee table, and an old TV were the only items in the living room. "The bedroom's down the hall," Derek said, his tone flat. "Bathrooms shared. No pets, no overnight guests." "Sounds good," Kevin said, trying to sound casual. Derek studied him for a moment before nodding. "Rent's due the first of the month. You can move in tonight if you want." Kevin didn't hesitate. By nightfall, his meager belongings were in the room, and he was settling into his new life. Derek kept to himself, which suited Kevin just fine. They exchanged polite nods but rarely spoke. The apartment was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but Kevin figured that was better than having a loud, intrusive roommate. Then, strange things started happening. It began with the locks. Kevin noticed the lock on his bedroom door had been tampered with, the screws slightly loosened. He asked Derek about it, but Derek just shrugged, muttering something about the previous tenant. One night, Kevin woke up to the faint creak of floorboards outside his room. His heart pounded as he strained to listen. The sounds stopped, but the next morning he found his bedroom door slightly ajar. He could have sworn he had closed it before going to bed. He started keeping a makeshift weapon, a heavy flashlight, under his pillow. Sleep came fitfully, and Kevin began to dread the nights. He tried telling himself it was just paranoia, that Derek was harmless, just a bit odd. Then came the whispers. Late at night, Kevin would hear them through the thin walls. Faint, unintelligible murmurs, like someone talking to themselves. He pressed his ear to the wall once, and the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. The next morning, Derek acted as if nothing was wrong. Kevin tried to stay out of the apartment as much as possible. He picked up extra shifts at work and spent hours at the library, not returning until he was sure Derek would be asleep. But Derek seemed to be everywhere. Kevin would catch glimpses of him in odd places, the corner of the library, across the street from Kevin's workplace, even once standing in the alley behind the apartment complex, staring up at Kevin's window. Kevin decided he had to leave. He started looking for another place, but his meager savings and bad luck kept him tied to the apartment. He began to feel like a caged animal, trapped by his circumstances. One night, Kevin woke up to a loud thud. Gripping his flashlight, he crept out of his room, his heart hammering in his chest. The living room was dark, but he could see Derek sitting on the couch, his back to Kevin. The TV was on, static hissing from the screen. "Derek?" Kevin called out, his voice trembling. Derek didn't respond. As Kevin stepped closer, he noticed something in Derek's lap, a notebook. It was open, and the pages were filled with Kevin's name, written over and over in a spidery scrawl. "Derek," Kevin repeated, more forcefully. Derek's head snapped around, his hollow eyes locking onto Kevin. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and guttural. Kevin backed away, but Derek stood up, the notebook falling to the floor. Kevin's flashlight beam caught something shiny in Derek's hand, a knife. Panic surged through Kevin as he bolted for the door. Derek was fast, but Kevin managed to slam the door shut behind him and run into the night. Kevin never returned to the apartment. He reported Derek to the police, but they found no trace of him. The apartment was empty, devoid of any furniture or personal belongings, as if Derek had never existed. Months later, Kevin was scrolling through Craigslist, looking for another place to live. His blood ran cold when he saw a new ad in the rooms for rent section. It was the same description, the same blurry photo, and it was posted under his name. The ad read, "Free furniture, must pick up tonight." The Craigslist post included a few grainy pictures, a vintage armchair, an old wooden dresser, and a large antique mirror. Jess was moving into her first apartment and needed furniture desperately. She couldn't believe her luck. The items had character, and best of all, they were free. She messaged the poster immediately and got a reply within minutes. "Come by 9 p.m., 47 Maple Street. Back alley entrance." The message read. Jess felt a twinge of unease, but pushed it aside. Free was free. The location wasn't far, so Jess borrowed her friend Mike's truck and drove over. The alley was dimly lit, with trash bins lining the walls and shadows stretching ominously across the pavement. She double-checked the address on her phone. This was the place. A man emerged from the shadows, startling her. He was tall, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes. "You're here for the furniture?" he asked, his voice raspy. Jess nodded. "Yeah, I messaged you earlier." The man didn't smile or offer any pleasantries. Instead, he motioned for her to follow. He led her to a side door and unlocked it with a set of jangling keys. The interior was pitch black until he flipped on a single flickering light. The room smelled musty, like damp wood and decay. The furniture was there, just like in the pictures. Jess's unease deepened as she noticed the mirror was much larger than she'd expected, its frame intricately carved with strange symbols. The armchair looked worn, the fabric stained and frayed, and the dresser had deep scratches gouged into its surface. "You'll need help loading them," the man said, his tone flat. "Let me grab something to tie them down." Jess nodded nervously as the man disappeared into the darkness. She began inspecting the furniture more closely, running her hand along the cool surface of the mirror. Her reflection seemed off. It moved a split second slower than she did, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make her stomach churn. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled, like water disturbed by a breeze. Jess stumbled backward, heart racing. She told herself it was a trick of the dim light, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The man returned with a bundle of rope, startling her. "Let's get these loaded," he said, his voice sharp. He seemed agitated now, his movements quick and jerky. They worked in silence, loading the items onto the truck. The mirror was the heaviest, and as they lifted it, Jess swore she saw a faint outline of something moving behind the glass. She bit her lip, telling herself it was just nerves. As they secured the last item, the man turned to Jess. "Whatever you do, don't look into the mirror at night," he said, his tone deadly serious. Jess froze. "What? Why?" The man didn't answer. He stepped back into the shadows and disappeared without another word. When Jess got home, she told herself the man had been trying to scare her for some sick reason. She hauled the furniture into her apartment, too exhausted to care. She leaned the mirror against the wall in her living room, promising herself she'd find a proper spot for it tomorrow. That night, she couldn't sleep. The man's warning echoed in her mind. At 3 a.m., unable to resist, she got out of bed and crept into the living room. The mirror loomed in the dark, its surface faintly reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. Her reflection stared back, but something was wrong. It wasn't her. The face in the mirror smiled, wide and unnatural, its eyes too large, too bright. Jess's blood turned to ice as the reflection raised a hand and waved, something she hadn't done. The smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Jess stumbled backward, tripping over the armchair. She heard a faint whisper, her name being called, over and over from the mirror. Paralyzed with fear, she grabbed a blanket and threw it over the glass, cutting off the reflection. The whispers stopped, but the room felt oppressive, as if something was waiting, watching. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Jess called Mike to come over. She didn't tell him the details, only that she wanted the mirror gone. When he arrived, they carried it to the truck together. The surface felt unnaturally cold under her fingertips. "What's with the creepy blanket?" Mike joked, trying to lighten the mood. Jess didn't answer. They drove to the edge of town, to a spot where people dumped old furniture. Jess didn't care about the fine. It had to go. They unloaded the mirror and left it leaning against a tree. As they drove away, Jess glanced in the rearview mirror. The antique mirror was still there, but her reflection stood beside it, waving. It started with a harmless post on Craigslist. Handyman needed for small job, good pay. The description was vague, but intriguing. Looking for someone to help with minor repairs in a private residence. Discretion is a must. It included an address in a quiet suburban neighborhood and promised $300 for a few hours' work. For Mark, who was in between jobs, it seemed like easy money. The house was exactly what he expected, an old Victorian with peeling paint and a slightly overgrown lawn. Mark knocked on the door and was greeted by a woman who appeared to be in her late 60s. She was small and frail, her face lined with wrinkles, but her smile was warm. "You must be Mark," she said, opening the door wider. "Come in. I'm Mrs. Hargrove." The interior was dim, the air thick with the scent of mothballs and something faintly metallic. The furniture was antique, and porcelain dolls lined the shelves, their glass eyes gleaming even in the low light. Mark suppressed a shiver. "I need help with the basement," Mrs. Hargrove explained. "The lights don't work, and there's a bit of a mess down there." She handed him a flashlight and led him to the basement door. "Careful on the stairs," she warned before disappearing into the kitchen. The stairs creaked ominously as Mark descended. The air grew colder the further down he went. He swept the flashlight across the space. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and a workbench piled high with tools. In the corner, he noticed something strange, a heavy metal door bolted into the wall. It looked out of place in the otherwise ordinary basement. Curious, Mark approached it and ran his fingers over the cold surface. The door had no handle, only a small window with iron bars. Peering inside, he saw nothing but darkness. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Hargrove's voice startled him. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her silhouette barely visible. "Yeah," Mark called back, "just wondering what's behind this door." There was a long pause before she replied. "Oh, that's just an old root cellar, been sealed off for years." Mark shrugged and got to work. The repairs were minor, fixing a few loose pipes and clearing some debris. But the whole time he felt an unsettling sensation, like he was being watched. Every so often, he thought he heard faint tapping sounds coming from the metal door. But when he stopped to listen, there was only silence. After finishing up, he climbed the stairs to find Mrs. Hargrove waiting with an envelope of cash. "Thank you, dear," she said with a smile. "You've been such a help." Mark left the house feeling uneasy but brushed it off as a case of overactive imagination. That night, however, he couldn't shake the feeling of those unseen eyes in the basement. The next day, he received a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have opened the basement door." Mark's stomach dropped. He hadn't opened the door. He hadn't even touched the bolts. The messages kept coming. "Don't go back there. They know you saw them. It's too late." He tried calling the number, but it was disconnected. Unable to ignore his growing paranoia, Mark decided to return to the house. He needed answers. But when he arrived, the house looked different. The lawn was overgrown, the windows boarded up. It looked abandoned. He knocked on the door, but there was no response. Peering through a crack in the boards, he saw the interior was covered in dust and cobwebs, the furniture rotting. It was as if no one had lived there for years. Mark called out for Mrs. Hargrove, his voice echoing in the empty street. He tried the door, and to his surprise, it swung open with a groan. The smell of decay hit him immediately, and he gagged. The basement door was open, revealing the dark staircase. Against every instinct, Mark descended, flashlight trembling in his hand. The basement was exactly as he'd left it, except for the metal door. It was ajar, the bolts scattered on the floor. From the shadows beyond the door, a faint sound emerged. It was a whisper, then a low growl, and then something began to crawl out. Mark screamed, dropping the flashlight as he scrambled up the stairs. Behind him, he heard heavy, wet footsteps and the sound of something dragging against the walls. He slammed the basement door shut and ran for his truck, peeling out of the driveway without looking back. That night, Mark barricaded himself in his apartment. The messages stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. 2 days later, his neighbor found his apartment door ajar. Inside, there was no sign of Mark, just a heavy metal door leaning against the wall, its bolts locked tight. The ad was simple: room for rent, cheap, perfect for students or young professionals. Call for details. Caitlin was desperate to escape her tiny studio apartment. The rent was killing her, and the thought of splitting costs sounded like a blessing. When she called, a soft-spoken man named Greg answered. He explained that the room was fully furnished, the utilities included, and it was available immediately. The price was almost too good to be true. Caitlin visited the house the next evening. It was older but charming, tucked away on a quiet street. Greg, a man in his early 40s, opened the door and greeted her warmly. He was polite, even a little shy. The room was upstairs, cozy, with a large bay window that let in plenty of light. She decided to take it on the spot. Her first night in the house was uneventful, though she couldn't ignore how quiet it was. Greg had mentioned he worked late hours, so she didn't expect to see much of him. But as the days passed, little things started to unsettle her. She noticed Greg rarely left his room during the day. Sometimes she'd hear faint murmuring behind his closed door, as if he were talking to someone. When she asked him about it, he brushed it off with a laugh. I talk to myself sometimes. Old habits. One evening, as she was settling in to watch TV, she heard footsteps in the attic above her room. At first, she assumed it was Greg, but when she went to ask him about it, he was in the kitchen, washing dishes. "Do you have a pet or something?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Greg shook his head. "Nope, just us here." That night, the noises continued. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, paced back and forth. Occasionally there was a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. Caitlin couldn't sleep, her eyes locked on the ceiling. Every instinct told her not to investigate, but curiosity won. She grabbed her phone for light and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The door creaked open, revealing a space cluttered with old boxes and furniture draped in dusty sheets. The air was stale, and the temperature felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. She scanned the room with her phone's flashlight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, just as she turned to leave, she heard it. A faint giggle, childlike but warped, coming from the far corner. Her light snapped to the source, but there was nothing there. She bolted downstairs, locking her bedroom door behind her. The next morning, Caitlin confronted Greg. "Is there someone else living here? I heard something in the attic." Greg's face darkened. "The attic? No one's up there. You shouldn't go up there. It's old and unsafe." His response only made her more suspicious, but she let it go. That night, as she lay in bed, she noticed something new. The faint smell of rot wafting through her room. It grew stronger until it became unbearable. She followed the stench to the closet, where she discovered a small door she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a pile of old coats. The door was locked, but the key was taped to the wall beside it. With shaking hands, she unlocked it and peered inside. It was a crawl space, just large enough for someone to lie down in. The smell was overwhelming now, and as her phone's flashlight illuminated the space, her breath caught in her throat. A small mattress lay on the floor, stained and rotting. Scattered around it were children's toys, old and broken. But what made her scream was the writing on the walls. "Let me out" was scrawled in dozens of places, scratched deep into the wood. Suddenly, she heard the attic door creak open above her, followed by hurried footsteps racing down the stairs. Caitlin froze as the footsteps stopped right outside her bedroom door. She called out, "Greg, is that you?" No response. The doorknob rattled violently, and a voice, high-pitched and sing-song, whispered through the crack, "You shouldn't have opened the door." Caitlin didn't wait. She grabbed her phone and bolted out the window, landing painfully on the lawn below. As she ran to the street, she glanced back at the house. Greg stood in the attic window, watching her. But it wasn't just him. A figure, small and twisted, stood beside him, grinning with hollow, black eyes. The police investigated the next day, but found no trace of Greg or the figure. The crawlspace was empty, the mattress and writing gone, as if they'd never been there. The landlord claimed the house had been vacant for years, and there was no record of anyone named Greg ever renting it. Caitlin moved far away, but she still wakes up some nights to the sound of footsteps outside her door, and a soft giggle in the dark. The Craigslist ad was cryptic. Moving help wanted. Urgent. No questions asked. Good pay. It was the kind of post that screamed red flag, but Tyler needed the money. The address was in a rural area, nearly an hour outside the city, but the promised $500 for a few hours' work was too good to pass up. Tyler arrived at dusk, the sun casting long shadows over the desolate countryside. The house was a sprawling, decrepit farmhouse, its peeling paint and sagging roof giving it an air of abandonment. A man emerged as Tyler parked. He was gaunt, with sunken eyes and a nervous energy that made Tyler uneasy. "Thanks for coming," the man said, wringing his hands. "I'm Aaron. We just need to clear out some furniture and boxes. Shouldn't take long." Inside, the house was dimly lit and eerily quiet. The air was stale, and a faint, sour smell lingered. Aaron led Tyler to a room at the back of the house filled with old furniture, crates, and boxes sealed with duct tape. "We're moving all this to the barn out back," Aaron explained. "Just be careful with the boxes. They're fragile." As they worked, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed too big for one person, yet there was no sign of anyone else. The photos on the walls were old and faded, depicting people Tyler didn't recognize but who bore the same haunted look as Aaron. While carrying a particularly heavy box, Tyler noticed something odd. It emitted a faint thumping sound, as if something inside was shifting. He set it down, trying not to think about it, but his curiosity got the better of him. "What's in these boxes?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Aaron froze, his eyes narrowing. "I said no questions, remember?" Tyler nodded quickly, deciding not to push, but as they continued, the thumping grew louder, more persistent. At one point, Tyler thought he heard a muffled cry coming from one of the crates, but when he paused to listen, Aaron appeared beside him, his face pale and strained. "Let's keep moving," Aaron said sharply. By the time they finished loading the barn, the sun had set, and the property was cloaked in darkness. Aaron handed Tyler a wad of cash and thanked him, but something about his demeanor suggested he was eager to get rid of him. Tyler drove off, but the strange noises from the boxes haunted him. Halfway home, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Did you hear them too?" Chilled, Tyler pulled over and texted back. "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "Don't go back." He blocked the number, shaking his head. It was probably someone messing with him, but curiosity gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, Tyler returned to the farmhouse the next day. The house looked different in the daylight, more derelict, almost as if it had aged decades overnight. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, the furniture and boxes they'd moved were gone, but the faint, sour smell lingered. He called out for Aaron, but the house was silent. Tyler ventured toward the barn, his heart pounding. The large doors creaked as he pushed them open. The crates were there, stacked haphazardly, but many of them were smashed open. On the dirt floor were long, deep scratches leading from the broken crates to the barn's open back door. Tyler followed the trail outside, where it disappeared into the woods. Suddenly, he heard it. A low, guttural growl, followed by faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He turned to run, but stopped when he saw something standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and gaunt, with unnaturally long limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Tyler stumbled backward, his breath hitching as the thing raised a hand and pointed at him. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. He ran, not stopping until he was back in his car, peeling away from the farmhouse as fast as he could. He didn't stop driving until he reached the city, where he spent the rest of the night locked in his apartment, jumping at every sound. The next morning, Tyler's phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. "They're coming." He blocked the number, but the text didn't stop. Each day, they became more frequent, more ominous, and each night he would hear faint whispers outside his window, growing louder, closer. The police didn't believe him, and when he tried to find the farmhouse again, it was as if it had never existed. The address led to an empty field, overgrown with weeds. Now Tyler sleeps with the lights on, though he rarely sleeps at all. The whispers are louder now, and sometimes he hears the growls too. Every night, he checks the locks on his door, but deep down he knows it's only a matter of time before they find him. The Craigslist ad read, "Free piano. Must pick up. Quick pickup preferred." Tessa had always wanted a piano. She wasn't a musician, but the idea of having one in her apartment felt elegant, sophisticated. The best part? It was free. The listing included a single photo, an old, slightly weathered upright piano sitting in what appeared to be a dimly lit living room. She called the number in the ad, and an older man answered. His voice was shaky, and he seemed eager for her to come immediately. She borrowed a friend's truck and arrived at the address late in the afternoon. The house was in a rundown neighborhood, its windows boarded up, and the front door was slightly ajar. Tessa hesitated, but her desire for the piano overruled her instincts. Inside, the house was nearly empty. save for the piano in the corner of the living room. The man, frail and hunched, shuffled out from the shadows. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes were bloodshot. "Take it," he croaked. "Please, just take it." Tessa tried to ask questions, how old it was, why he was giving it away, but the man waved her off, mumbling something about needing it gone. With help from her friend, she loaded the piano into the truck and took it back to her apartment. It was heavy, cumbersome, and by the time they had it settled against the wall in her living room, it was nearly midnight. That night, as she lay in bed, Tessa thought she heard faint music, soft, uneven notes, as though someone were lightly pressing the keys. She assumed it was her imagination or the neighbors and fell asleep. The next morning, she noticed something odd. The keys, which she remembered being dusty and yellowed, now looked clean, almost polished. She chalked it up to her friend wiping them down the night before. Later that day, Tessa invited a friend over to see the piano. As she ran her fingers over the keys, a sour note rang out, a discordant, jarring sound that seemed out of place. Her friend laughed nervously. "Creepy," she said. "It sounds angry." That night, the music returned, louder this time. Tessa sat up in bed, her heart racing as the notes grew more frantic, chaotic. She tiptoed into the living room, her phone's flashlight trembling in her hand. The piano stood silent, but the bench had moved, pulled slightly away as if someone had just been sitting there. She laughed nervously, blaming her tired mind, and went back to bed. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. She'd wake up to find the piano keys pressed down, as if someone had been playing them. Items in her apartment were moved, small things at first, like books and candles. Then larger things, like her coffee table, shifted several feet from where she'd left it. One evening, she noticed deep scratches on the floor beneath the piano, as though it had been dragged across the room. But she lived alone, and the piano was far too heavy for her to move. Her breaking point came late one night when she was awoken by a loud crash. She ran to the living room to find the piano tilted forward, its front panel splintered, revealing the strings and hammers inside. But there was something else, something that made her stomach churn. Tucked within the strings was a photograph, old and faded. It showed a family, a mother, father, and a young boy, standing beside the very same piano. The boy's face had been scratched out, and scrawled across the photo in jagged handwriting were the words, "It wasn't my fault." Terrified, Tessa tried to contact the man who had given her the piano, but the phone number was disconnected. When she returned to the house, it was boarded up, abandoned, as though no one had lived there in years. Desperate, she decided to get rid of the piano. She posted her own Craigslist ad, offering it for free. A young couple came to pick it up the next day, thanking her profusely. That night, her apartment was eerily silent. For the first time in weeks, she slept soundly. The relief was short-lived. A week later, she received a message from an unknown number. "Why did you give it to them? They didn't deserve it." Her heart sank as she realized the scratches on her floor had returned. Only now, they led from the living room to her bedroom. That night, she heard the piano again, playing a slow, mournful tune from just outside her door. The Craigslist ad caught Emma's eye immediately. Room for rent, quiet house, low rent, immediate move-in. Emma was desperate for a place. She was new to the city, broke, and tired of couch surfing at friends' apartments. The ad seemed perfect, and the price was suspiciously low, but she convinced herself it was just her luck turning around. She responded to the listing and got an almost instant reply. The landlord, a man named Mr. Grayson, asked her to come by the same evening. The address was on the outskirts of town, a sprawling Victorian house surrounded by trees. When Emma arrived, the house loomed over her like a shadow, its dark windows staring down at her. She hesitated, but reminded herself she didn't have many options. Mr. Grayson answered the door. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, with a thin frame and a polite but distant demeanor. "The room's upstairs," he said, leading her through the house. The interior smelled faintly of mothballs and something metallic. The furniture was old but well kept, and the walls were lined with faded portraits of somber-looking people. Her room was small but clean, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the backyard. "The other tenants are quiet," Mr. Grayson said. "We like to keep it peaceful here." She didn't meet any of the other tenants that night, but she heard muffled footsteps and the occasional creak of doors. It made sense. Not everyone would want to socialize with a new housemate immediately. She unpacked her things, tired but relieved to finally have a space to herself. That night, as she lay in bed, Emma woke to the sound of soft tapping. It was faint, coming from somewhere inside the walls. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the old house settling. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like fingers drumming against wood. She turned on her lamp and scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The next morning, she asked Mr. Grayson about it. "Oh, this house makes all kinds of noises," he said with a dismissive wave. "Nothing to worry about." Over the next few days, the tapping continued, always at night. Sometimes it sounded as if it were coming from behind the dresser, other times from the closet. Emma began to notice other strange things. Her belongings were slightly out of place, though that her bedroom door was cracked open in the mornings, even though she was sure she'd closed it. One night, she heard faint whispers accompanying the tapping. Pressing her ear to the wall, she could almost make out words, but the whispers were too low, too muffled. They sounded like someone trying to speak through gritted teeth. She told herself it was her imagination and tried to sleep. A few nights later, Emma finally met one of the other tenants. She was coming back from the bathroom when she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, her back turned, her long hair tangled and hanging down her back. Emma called out, but the woman didn't respond. She stepped closer, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. "Hi," Emma said softly. "I'm Emma. I just moved in." The woman slowly turned her head, but her face was wrong, too pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink into her skull. Emma froze. A scream caught in her throat as the figure dissolved into the shadows of the hallway. She rushed back to her room, locking the door and sitting on the bed with her back against the wall. The whispers started again, louder this time, and the tapping became frantic, like something was trying to claw its way through the walls. Emma decided she had to leave. She packed her bag, but as she reached for the doorknob, she froze. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural voice coming from the other side of the door. "Stay," it rasped. "You belong here." Terrified, Emma backed away, clutching her bag. The doorknob began to rattle violently, and the lights in the room flickered. She ran to the window, throwing it open and climbing out onto the roof. She didn't stop running until she was halfway down the street, the house looming behind her like a dark, hungry thing. Emma never went back for her belongings. When she tried to contact Mr. Grayson to explain, the number was disconnected. Curious and unnerved, she looked up the house online. What she found made her stomach turn. The house had been abandoned for years, its last known owner, a man named Grayson, having vanished decades ago. The ad was gone from Craigslist, and no trace of the house's current occupants could be found. But sometimes, late at night, Emma swears she can still hear the tapping, faint and insistent, as if it's following her wherever she goes. The Craigslist ad was simple. Free antique doll found in grandma's attic. Must go ASAP. Lena wasn't particularly into antiques, but the doll intrigued her. The photo in the ad showed a porcelain doll in an old-fashioned dress, its delicate features framed by dark, curly hair. Something about the eyes, they seemed too lifelike, as though they were watching whoever looked at the photo. She messaged the seller out of curiosity. The reply came quickly. "You can pick it up tonight. Please take it off my hands. I'll leave it on the porch." When Lena arrived at the house, it was almost too dark to see. The porch light flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows. The doll sat in a small wooden rocking chair, staring out into the night. Lena hesitated. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself didn't want her there. But she shook off the feeling and picked up the doll. It was heavier than she expected, its cold porcelain sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced at the house, hoping to thank the seller, but the windows were dark and no one came to the door. Back at her apartment, Lena placed the doll on a shelf in her living room. She told herself she'd clean it up and maybe sell it online. But as she sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, she could swear she felt eyes on her. She looked up, and for a moment, she thought the doll's head had turned slightly to the side. She laughed nervously and dismissed it as her imagination. That night, she woke up to a strange noise, a faint creaking like wood bending under pressure. Half asleep, she assumed it was her neighbors upstairs. But as she turned over, she froze. The rocking chair in the corner of her bedroom, where she had placed the doll before going to bed, was moving, back and forth, slowly. She fumbled for the light, and when it flickered on, the chair was still. The doll sat motionless, its glassy eyes staring directly at her. She told herself it must have been a draft or vibrations from the building, and forced herself to go back to sleep. Over the next few days, things got stranger. Items in her apartment weren't where she'd left them. Lights flickered constantly. Her phone would die inexplicably, and the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Once, while brushing her teeth, she glanced in the bathroom mirror and saw the doll sitting on the counter behind her, except she hadn't put it there. Convinced she was imagining things, Lena decided to return the doll to the house. But when she drove back to the address from the ad, there was no house, just an overgrown lot. Confused and unnerved, she left the doll on the empty lot and drove home, her heart racing. That night, she felt a strange sense of relief. The apartment felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere gone. She poured herself a glass of wine and curled up on the couch, finally at ease. Until she saw it. The rocking chair in the corner of her living room was moving again, creaking softly. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head toward the shelf. The doll was back, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its painted lips seemed to curl into a faint, malicious smile. Then she heard it, a child's whisper, soft and close, right next to her ear. "You shouldn't have left me there. The lights went out." The Craigslist ad seemed harmless enough. Handyman needed, cash payment, one-night job, discretion required. Tyler was broke and behind on rent. The offer sounded perfect, a quick fix-it job with cash on the spot. The poster, a man named Daniel, sent the address, an old remote farmhouse miles from town. Tyler ignored the uneasy feeling in his gut. He needed the money. When he arrived, the house looked abandoned, its peeling paint and sagging porch bathed in the faint glow of a single bulb. Daniel, a wiry man with a nervous energy, greeted him at the door. "Glad you came," he said, his voice tight. "Follow me." The job was to fix a door in the basement that wouldn't stay shut. Tyler didn't ask questions. He'd dealt with weirder requests before. But as he descended the creaky staircase, he felt a chill in the air. The basement was cluttered with strange objects. Old dolls missing limbs, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and a thick layer of dust coating everything except the door in question. It was a heavy wooden door reinforced with steel brackets, and it didn't seem to lead anywhere. Behind it there was no draft, no sound, just solid silence. "What's on the other side?" Tyler asked. "Just storage," Daniel said quickly. Too quickly. Tyler shrugged and got to work. The latch was rusted, the hinges bent. As he hammered and adjusted, he noticed strange carvings on the door's frame. Symbols he didn't recognize, jagged and uneven, as though etched in a hurry. As he tightened the final bolt, he felt a vibration, faint at first but growing stronger. The door began to rattle violently, though the latch was now secure. A low, guttural noise seeped through the cracks like an animal growling, except it wasn't an animal. Tyler stepped back. "What the hell is that?" Daniel paled. "It's nothing. Just finish the job." "Yo, quickly." The growling turned into a chorus of whispers, dozens of voices speaking in an unintelligible language. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. Tyler backed away, but Daniel grabbed his arm. "You can't leave until it's done," he hissed. His grip was like iron, his calm veneer cracking. "The door has to stay shut." "What is this?" Tyler yelled, pulling free. Before Daniel could answer, the door burst open. A wave of cold air surged out, carrying with it the stench of decay. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like smoke. From the darkness beyond the door, something stepped forward, something tall, hunched, and impossibly wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its elongated limbs twitched as though it wasn't used to moving in this world. Daniel screamed, "Don't let it out!" He lunged for the door, but the creature was faster. It grabbed him with clawed hands, pulling him into the blackness. His screams echoed, then stopped abruptly. Tyler bolted for the stairs, the whispers now a deafening roar. He could feel the thing behind him, its presence like ice against his back. He reached the top and slammed the basement door shut, grabbing a chair to wedge it closed. The house shook, but the door held. He didn't wait to find out what happened next. Tyler sprinted to his truck, peeling out of the driveway, his hands trembling on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the farmhouse sat dark and silent, as though nothing had happened. When he checked Craigslist the next day, the ad was gone. There was no sign of Daniel, no news about the farmhouse. But Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had let loose was still out there, and it wasn't finished with him. The Craigslist ad read, "Free room and board in exchange for light housekeeping duties. Must start immediately." Rachel didn't think twice before replying. She was broke and crashing on a friend's couch, and the idea of free rent sounded like a dream. The poster, a woman named Margaret, responded almost instantly and invited Rachel to come by that evening. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, and when Rachel arrived, it was already dark. The house was large, old, and surrounded by towering oaks that cast long shadows under the streetlights. Margaret answered the door with a warm smile. She was in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and a composed demeanor. "Come in, dear. I'm so glad you're here." Inside, the house was meticulously clean, almost unnaturally so. Everything was in its place, from the antique furniture to the ornate knickknacks on the shelves. Margaret led Rachel to her room, which was simple but cozy, a small bed, a dresser, and a desk near a window that overlooked the backyard. "The job is easy," Margaret explained. "Just some dusting, vacuuming, and light cooking. Nothing too strenuous. I like my house to stay orderly." Rachel agreed, relieved at how simple it sounded. That night, she unpacked her few belongings and fell asleep easily, feeling grateful for the opportunity. But by the second night, strange things began to happen. Rachel woke to the sound of soft humming. She assumed it was Margaret, but when she got up to check, the house was dark and silent. The humming seemed to come from the walls, faint and melodic. It stopped as soon as she reached for the light switch. The next morning, Margaret seemed oblivious when Rachel mentioned it. "Oh, this old house makes all kinds of noises," she said with a wave of her hand. "Nothing to worry about." Over the next few days, Rachel noticed more oddities. The furniture in her room seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking. Her shoes were moved from the closet to under the bed. One night, she woke to find her window open, even though she was certain she'd locked it. Then there was the basement door. It was always locked, and Margaret had explicitly told her it was off limits. "Just old storage down there," she'd said. But Rachel couldn't ignore the scratching noises she occasionally heard coming from the other side, like fingernails against wood. One evening, while Margaret was out, Rachel's curiosity got the better of her. She searched the house for the key to the basement and eventually found it tucked in a drawer in the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the door and descended the creaky stairs. The basement was cold and smelled of mildew. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs. But in the far corner, she noticed something strange. A large mirror, its ornate frame tarnished with age. The glass was cracked in several places, but it seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. As she approached, Rachel felt an inexplicable chill. Her reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. It moved slower than she did, lagging behind as though it were struggling to keep up. Then, as she stood frozen, her reflection smiled. Rachel stumbled back, her heart racing. The reflection stepped closer to the glass, its movements fluid and unnatural. It raised a hand and tapped on the inside of the mirror, the sound echoing like a knock on hollow wood. Suddenly, the lights in the basement flickered, and the air grew heavy. Rachel turned to run, but froze when she heard Margaret's voice behind her. "I told you not to come down here." Rachel spun around, but it wasn't Margaret. It was something wearing her face, its features stretched and distorted, its smile too wide. The thing lunged at her, and Rachel screamed, tripping over a box and falling to the floor. When she scrambled to her feet, the mirror was empty. No reflection, no cracks, just smooth, dark glass. Rachel didn't wait to find out more. She ran upstairs, grabbed her bag, and bolted from the house. She didn't stop running until she reached the end of the block. The next day, she checked the Craigslist ad, but it was gone. The house, when she drove by later, looked abandoned, its windows boarded up as if no one had lived there in years. But late at night, when Rachel closes her eyes, she swears she can still see the mirror, its cracked surface, and the thing behind it, waiting.